doing the cyclical thing, as in with oil, producers are not responding to the high prices. Are metal producers responding to the high prices?
The problem we have in lots of commodity markets, but particularly in metals, is there's such a long lead time. So high prices now don't directly relate to a new copper mine tomorrow. In the case of copper, actually, you could be looking at a 10-year timeline. So it's very difficult to immediately match supply and demand. We do expect, and there are forecasts for metal supply across most of the major metals to increase over the next 12 months or so, but there still could be, additional breaks in the supply chain, ongoing issues with energy, which look pretty likely, that could sort of disrupt that new supply.
It's interesting because the German economy was downgraded today by the economic institutes in Germany for this year, their forecast on supply chain issues. Now, that's just not metals, but Germany is a metal-bashing industrial country, and it is certainly seeing shortages. The expectation was that some of those supply chain issues are going to fade next year. What is your outlook? What do you think is going to happen in terms of pricing? You talk about the fact that it takes years to bring on new supply. Is industry just going to have to learn to live with these higher prices?
We've seen these types of moves in commodity markets are things that we, rightly or wrongly, see quite regularly. So, we know that there will be a price at which demand starts to be adjusted downwards, and we're seeing that to some extent already. We will expect at some point to see improvement in these supply chains, although it's difficult to say, how long that will take. Mm-hmm. So we know that markets will adjust. We know that there'll be new technologies to use. We know that we're pretty good at fixing, high prices. It's just a matter of how long it takes.
Right. Is there one commodity that's different? I always hate to say that, but one that can't ramp up supply even if you're looking at a decade, or one where the demand is just so strong?
I think the crude oil market is a really interesting one to look at if you've got a very long-term view, because as we move through the energy transition, we're already seeing that long-term, capital that's been put into that market is falling. And so while we're not necessarily going to run out of crude oil, and that's, almost certainly not going to happen, our ability to access it quickly could change as we move towards the use of other energy sources, and that's where we put our capital.
But this is the problem, is that we're facing a supply shortage. We've got an energy problem, and we're going to get huge demand. If we want to electrify the world in the way that we're talking about with the 2050 goals, then we're going to need a lot of copper. We're going to need aluminium if we can't get the copper. To Alex's point about substitution, how much substitution is possible if demand remains elevated, because there is a political and environmental imperative to move from where we are now with hydrocarbons into a more electrified world?
I think we all knew that the sort of energy transition would be, it would take some time, and that there'd be bumps along the road. I think the problem we're seeing now is that maybe we didn't anticipate the size of those bumps or the duration of those bumps. But we would expect that technology and human ingenuity will save us. It's just a matter of how long we have to deal with the current situation that we have, which is pretty unpleasant if you're an energy-intensive industry such as the metals industry is.
All right, thanks so much, Fiona. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Fiona Bull of S&P Dow Jones Indices. Thanks a lot. And later on today with Commodities Edge, join me. We're going to dive into metals. Plus, it's my conversation with Moji Karimi. He's the CEO of Cmvita Factory. It's basically a startup that's using CO2 captured by Occidental Petroleum. They use that to basically make green ethylene. And then whatever you use, ethylene makes plastic, guys. So when you use that ethylene, what you're making is a lot greener. This is a venture with Oxy Venture Partners, which is sort of their VC arm from Occidental. And it's these kind of partnerships that I'm seeing a lot in the industry that are going to help to green it more quickly.
Well, that's the innovation that Fiona was just talking about. Ingenuity is going to have to rise to the rescue here. in terms of dealing with some of these problems. We need to make this shift. We've got to figure out how to do it better and more efficiently.
Yeah.
And that's going to require a lot of innovation. A lot of the technology hasn't been invented yet to make this happen. But I thought her point at the end about the fact that I don't think we'd fully onboarded the idea that some of these big bumps in terms of the supply chains and how everything matches up are going to be significantly larger than we originally thought. And I think that's what we're living through right now. It's going to be a really volatile period.
Which then makes it all the more important that the energy stuff that we're using, coal, natural gas, oil, is done more greenly, which kind of circles me back to Commodities Edge and talking to the CEO, because Occidental, for example, if this business model works for them, that's a business. They can capture their CO2 and then sell it. And that's a really good, then profitable way to green your industry while you're also producing the stuff that no one wants but they need at the end of the day.
The energy stuff that we all are using needs to be done more greenly.
Classic.
That's my quote for the day.
Classic steel. All right, coming up, an exclusive interview with Ana Botín, Santander chief executive, that's coming up next. This is Bloomberg.
Access the financial world on demand. Hear from leading economists, policymakers, and industry experts via live and on-demand webinars, only from Bloomberg. Start exploring to see what's moving the markets. Visit Bloomberg.com/webinars.
Did you make the decision to move to the Bahamas of all the options out there?
We've been looking at the Bahamas for a while. They're one of the first countries to roll out any comprehensive regulation for cryptocurrencies, which we think is extremely important for the space and a really positive sign.
Banco Santander's executive chairman, Ana Botín, discussed the relationship of inflation and greening the economy, a topic the guy and I are passionate about and talk a lot about. She joined Bloomberg for an exclusive.
Well, there's a lot of talk, and this is linked to the big issue in financial markets today, which is inflation, which is this a temporary issue? And I believe it is, in the sense that, COVID is a one-off, and it sort of created a spike, but U.S., China already ahead of where they were pre-COVID. Europe will be there in Q1. And so I do think energy is a factor, but hopefully it's part of the broader picture of how do we green the economy at a cost that we can afford and that is fair, and where the cost is borne by everybody in a fair way.
Banco Santander's executive chair, Ana Botín, speaking exclusively to Francine a little bit earlier on. I think it's interesting. The banks are clearly at the centre of this process, Alex. They are firmly in control of, I think, some of the key levers in terms of the greening process, the Greenly process that we're all going to have to go through. When the energy stuff and the Greenly and that kind of thing
the
needs to happen.
The energy stuff that we all use, we need to get it Greenly. Come on, it's not that hard.
Okay, sorry. I want to talk to an expert about this. So yeah, and the financials are definitely there. If the financials are on board with this and they can figure out how to make this happen, they are going to be the ultimate gatekeepers of this process, because they are going to be there the point at which this stuff needs to get funded.
It's true, but isn't that what Bill Winters had said earlier in the week to Bloomberg as well? That like banks cannot stop lending to energy companies because we clearly need the energy. That's why it's so important to get that energy greenly. That's the lower, you guys. That's the lower. Take the stuff we all need and make it greenly.
But it's interesting. So you look at Texas; they won't do business with banks if they don't. If they push back on this stuff.
Which is
so maybe he's
another problem with U.S. producers. It's the same kind of thing. Like they're not responding to the price right now because of shareholders. They don't want them to. They want the returns instead, and that leaves President Biden, at some point probably calling up Saudi Arabia, being like, "Can you please pump more so oil and gasoline prices go down?" That's what we were all supposed to avoid by being energy independent.
Yeah, that's crazy because the U.S. has clearly the capability of doing this, but now everybody is basically being told by their shareholders that you can't invest on this stuff. It's going to be interesting to see how the hedge funds do well out of this, though, because certainly this is an area that they feel they can invest in, despite the fact they obviously want to kind of focus on the ESG. There's big money to be made over here. The European markets are about to close. This is Bloomberg.
From New York City.
We're in London, in Sydney,
in San Francisco.
9 a.m. in Beijing and Shanghai.
Good morning, everyone.
Have a great evening.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak with Lee.
Balance of Power on Bloomberg Radio.
Welcome to Daybreak Australia.
This is Bloomberg Technology.
And this is Bloomberg Green.
To recap the headlines.
You do not want to miss this story.
Really good news on the jobless claims front.
How are you thinking about those dynamics?
Google is saying it has accelerated innovation in the country and it's planning to appeal the FTC's decision. What's your take on this and how do you plan for further scrutinies?
We are going to see what they make and what changes they are actually bring to this market.
So we're wrapping up the Thursday session here in Europe, a positive one for European equities, as you can see behind me. Main markets up up quite nicely. Really decent bounces being delivered by the CAC 40 in France, up by 1.4%. The DAX is up by 1.4%. The FTSE 100 is up by 1%. The Milan market is up by 1.3%. Really strong performances coming through here. A number of different drivers. Clearly what is happening in the energy market, the metals market, having an impact in terms of driving those basic material stocks and the energy stocks higher as well. Banks a factor. Look at what is happening over in the States as well. All of this in the mix. We've got earnings as well. Plus we've got buybacks. Adidas, a company that stands out there, being driven higher and helping the DAX. Intraday, we are back in the middle of the 4.6s. 466 now for the stock 600. Remember, we've been high as kind of the mid-high 470s. Recently, we've been in the 450s. So we're kind of back mid-range. But as you can see, the trajectory today moving higher, up by 1.24% in aggregate for the stock 600. Let's take a look at the GRR. How does it break down? Where's the stock rotation story happening? Well, as I say, basic resources doing well. Technology's bouncing. The TSMC results feeding into the ASML story. That's helping out. We've got the luxury sector continuing to bounce really quite nicely. Financial services looking good. Everything's up, but the underperformance comes from the healthcare, the utilities, and the staples, the defensive areas of the market not performing that strongly today. But individual names certainly continue to be a really big focus right now. As I mentioned, Adidas up quite strongly, announcing another big buyback, I should really say. Adidas bouncing on the back of that. ASML, the lithography company, it makes the kit the chip makers use to make chips. You saw what happened with TSMC a little bit earlier on. That feeds back into ASML. Leonardo's an interesting story. This is this company that used to be called Finmeccanica, now called Leonardo, based out of Italy, unsurprisingly. And it looks like there's some reporting suggesting that some faulty, I think they're titanium fasteners, which basically are used to put together the Boeing 787, the Dreamliner, which you remember is a composite body, a composite tube, effectively, in terms of that aircraft's manufacturing process. And the reporting suggests that the fault is being traced back to Leonardo. Leonardo's stock dropped like an absolute stone on the back of this as that news started to come out, and has remained down. In fact, it's accelerated over the last hour on the downside. The stock is now down by 7%. Remember, the 787 has just got a series of ongoing problems related to that aircraft. This latest piece of bad news certainly impacting Leonardo. The issue of what is happening in the aerospace sector is fascinating at the moment because, as I say, the 787 composite body that was designed to make the aircraft more efficient and more greenly, as Alex would say, greener, more efficient. But the industry now faces huge challenges with net zero coming up. Governments and industries across the world really kind of wrestling with the challenge of figuring out how to modernize and improve and make more sustainable the aviation industry. The power plants are going to be absolutely central to that. Rolls-Royce today having a sustainability event ahead of COP up in Derby at its factory there. And I had the opportunity to catch up with the CEO, Warren East, to talk about kind of where we're going. Is it sustainable aviation fuel? Is it electric motors? Is it hydrogen? Kind of which is the best option? Because different people are talking about different things. I asked Warren where he stood, where he sees the biggest focus being.
You have different technology solutions for different applications. So for a very short distance with relatively few people, that could be a pure electric aircraft. All the energy is stored in a battery. For something that goes a little bit further, or perhaps has a few more passengers, then it might be a hybrid electric solution, or it might be a hydrogen fuel cell. For something that has lots of people and goes a long way, then the only way that we as a whole industry, in fact, can see of storing enough energy in a small enough space with a small enough weight is to use synthetic aviation fuel. And so there isn't one answer to the problem, which is why you're hearing different answers. It depends on the context.
Does that mean that effectively you are going to have to develop 3 different types of technologies? I'm assuming that that's going to be relatively expensive.
Well, as a sector, there will, I think, be multiple types of technologies, and it is expensive. But actually, if you look at what exists today, the situation I just described, I mean, yes, they'd all today be gas turbines burning fossil fuel, but you know, a very small gas turbine is completely different from the large engine that you see behind me.
Yep.
And so I don't think in terms of incremental it's a lot.